Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Fuqua's LinkedIn Live series. I am Gavin Fitzsimmons. I'm a faculty member here at Duke in the Fuqua School. I'm a consumer psychologist by training, so I study sort of the hows and whys consumers do what they do, why we buy what we buy, why we eat what we eat, et cetera. And today I'm going to be telling you a little bit about some work that we've been doing over the last couple of years, examining how feeling kind of financially constrained or tight financially can impact how happy we are with the things we actually buy. Um, so this is the work that I'll be talking with you about today is based on some of the dissertation work of Rodrigo Diaz, who's an amazing PhD student here at Fuqua. And both myself and Isha Sharma, who's a faculty member out at San Diego State, have been advising Rodrigo on this research. Um, so it's probably not a shock to many of you guys that are watching that feeling constrained financially is an experience that many of us have in life. And let me just interrupt for a moment and just say that please, I really want this to not just be me talking to you, but please submit any questions you have through the comment section, and I'll do my best to answer them as we're going along. Um, but then, yes, so back, the last couple of years, uh, through the pandemic and everything else that people have been dealing with, have been hard on many of us, and it's not a shock that many people have felt pressure on their financial situation. Gas prices are about double what they were, 2 years ago. Everything feels like, inflationary pressure is there. And so everything feels like the prices are going up. And as a result, many of us have this feeling like, maybe my dollar isn't going as far as it used to be. Interestingly enough, we find that this feeling of financial constraint impacts consumers almost independent of their level of income. So folks at the lower end of the income spectrum can feel financially constrained. People at the high end of the income spectrum can feel financially constrained. And so it's not so much how much money you have per se, but it's how you feel about it and whether you feel like there's this pressure that is impacting you. And so that's really what Rodrigo and Isha and I set out to study was, you know, we know that people are feeling financially constrained, and is that impacting them in terms of how happy they are with the things they ultimately buy? So we're going to make purchases despite feelings of financial constraint, and are they impacted by the feeling of financial constraint? Is that really the big sort of research question? And there one of the things that prior research had shown was that sometimes when you're feeling financially constrained, it's a negative of, an aversive state, if you like, and you want to get out of that negative state. And so one of the ways that consumers have at their disposal is to make a purchase, and it sometimes improves your sort of feeling at the time. And so we've known for a while that when people feel constrained, they will sometimes try to buy their way out of it. You've probably heard the term retail therapy as a way to get out of a negative emotional state. And so what was not known really prior to the work that I'm about to tell you about was whether it was actually effective. Like, does it actually make you happier when you make a purchase in that experience of financial constraint? And so we started with a kind of a relatively straightforward premise that it could be negative, it could be positive. So the positive would be, it makes you feel a little better to make that purchase. The negative might be that maybe it's not as effective as you might have hoped, and thus, it's not getting you out of that negative state. And so basically so we're, as I mentioned, I'm a consumer psychologist, and our approach generally is to try to run an experiment to test ideas. And so what we're going to try to do is look at folks that are either experiencing financial constraints or not experiencing financial constraints. Then we're going to observe a purchase that they've made. And then we're going to either ask them directly, how happy are you with that purchase? Or we're going to measure through a proxy, online reviews, for example, how happy they are with that purchase. And so that's the basic setup. And in the very first studies that we ran, in the first one, we are actually going to measure people's experiences of financial constraint. I thought I'd just read you a quick a word, a way that we would measure that. So, for example, to what extent do you feel financially constrained? To what extent do you feel you can spend your money freely? How would you rate your financial situation relative to your peers? So those are pretty straightforward questions. Most people have no trouble answering them. And we're going to use those to determine who is feeling financially constrained and who is not. And again, we're going to control for lots of other factors like where you live, what your income level is, all of these kinds of things as well. And really, we're going to focus then on people that are feeling high or low in financial constraint and how happy they are with their purchase. And the very first result that we found was that if you're currently feeling financially constrained and you make a purchase, so for example, we often ask people to describe a purchase that they had made between $100 and $1,000. So it's not a trivial purchase, but not the most consequential purchase you'll make in your life. And then to describe how happy they were with that purchase. And what we find is that to the degree you're feeling more financially constrained and you make a purchase, you're actually less happy with that purchase than you would have been if you weren't feeling financially constrained. Now, note that that's not, at least in our view, it wasn't completely straightforward that this would be the result, because if you're feeling financially constrained, you feel like you have a limited amount of resources, maybe, and you buy, a new television for the family. It could be that by being able to buy that television, given you have limited finances, you'd be even more happy with that TV, right? Because, wow, look, I managed to buy this television and now the TV is here and we really love it. But that's not what we found. We found the opposite. We found that new TV that you've purchased, you're less happy if you're purchasing it when you're feeling financially constrained. And so, we replicate that basic result many times, actually, across many, many thousands of consumers. I think we've talked to over 25,000 consumers across this entire research project. And we find the result is really robust. Sometimes we'll measure financial constraints, and sometimes we'll actually, manipulate financial constraints, where we'll activate the feeling of financial constraints for one group of consumers and not activate it for another. And we find that when we activate the feeling of financial constraints for a group of consumers, again, the purchases that they make, they feel a little less happy with. And when I say a little less, this is it's not like we take someone where they buy a new TV and they, would say, oh yeah, I'm, extremely happy. And by being financially constrained, it doesn't turn them into someone that hates the TV, but it substantially reduces the happiness that they experience for that television by feeling financially constrained when they make the purchase. So, why might this be the case? What would drive, or why would being financially constrained when you make a purchase lead you to feel less happy with the purchases that you make? And so we've done a lot of work trying to investigate the underlying psychological process that would lead to this result. And what we ultimately have come to focus on is something that we call opportunity cost consideration. And it's kind of jargony, so sorry, but I'll try to give you some intuition. So imagine that you're going to buy a new blender for the kitchen, okay? Um, and you feel financially constrained, right? The money just doesn't, that you really notice that the cost of gas has gone up, and that you're feeling this pressure financially. Um, and you're going to you buy a new blender, all right? Uh, in the case when you're feeling financial constraints, what we find is that the people that buy the blender afterwards think a lot about what else they could have done with that money. So instead of buying the fancy blender, I could have bought, a new toaster oven. And I find myself afterwards, after the purchase of the blender, thinking a lot about, yeah, that toaster oven would have been really great. And as a result, that sort of that opportunity cost, the thing that I could have done with the money, weighs on me. And it's because that weighs on me that I end up um, with this reduced happiness for the blender. And we've done this in a lot of different ways to try to sort of highlight that this is occurring. But I'll just say, maybe mention a couple of different things that we've done. So one of the ways that we sort of highlighted the impact of opportunity cost is after if for people that are not feeling financially constrained, so I'm not worried about money, it's not stressing me out. If I ask you after you've made a purchase, so you bought the blender, and now I say to you explicitly, hey, Gavin, I want you to think about all the other uses you could have used that money for. When I do that, and I get the consumer to think about the alternative uses they could have had for the money, all of a sudden they look a lot like the people that were feeling financial constraints. And so you take someone that's low in financial constraint, not worried about money, you get them to think about all the other uses they could have had, all the opportunity costs they could have had for the money they spent the blender on, and all of a sudden they too reduce their happiness. And so it's pretty good evidence that the reason this thing is operating the way it does is that when I feel financial pressure, it's making me, when I make a purchase, think about all the other things I maybe could or should have done with that money. So I mentioned early that, we don't just, one of the ways is just to ask consumers directly how happy they are with their purchases. Another approach is to look at reviews. And so we take advantage of the fact that that consumers are spontaneously reviewing things nowadays on lots of different platforms. One of the platforms that we were able to utilize was Yelp. If you're not familiar, it's an online review. You leave a review of all sorts of products and services. Rodrigo took the data, collected the data on Yelp for, let me make sure I get this right, 15 large restaurant chains in America, and took Yelp reviews in the 15 largest cities that those chains operated in. And then Rodrigo then collected census data on all of the zip codes that those restaurants were located in and operating in, and as well as some information about information about folks through this census data. And then he merged these data sets. And so what he ended up with was a data set of, an Applebee's, for example, in the Chicago area, in the west side of Chicago, and an Applebee's in the east side of Chicago. And he had the actual reviews of the restaurant in these two, sides or zip codes of town. And then he was able to look at uh, some information that we had collected through another source about how financially stressed people were in those zip codes. All right, so now we're doing it at a group level versus the stuff that I talked about earlier at an individual level. And what he found was the exact same pattern we observed at the individual level with happiness now in online reviews. So, for example, imagine that folks on the west side of Chicago were feeling more financially stressed than folks on the east side of Chicago. What we find is that the reviews for Applebee's on the west side, where the folks are feeling financially stressed, are actually lower than those on the east side of town. And so we're picking up that that there's stress financially on groups of consumers, and that they're essentially, I don't know if it's the right way to say, taking it out. They're that stress is impacting how happy they are with the experiences that they have when they visit an Applebee's. We did a similar study where we actually uh, basically manipulated whether people were financially constrained or not, had them describe a product that they had received, and then gave them like a Yelp style interface where they described, they wrote a review, and just as if you would when you were online. And then we used a variety of both human coders, research assistants that looked at the text of the reviews. We also used some sort of machine algorithms, which are created to interpret a text passage, so a review that a consumer writes, and to determine how positive or negative that is. And both with the human coders and with the sort of machine sort of algorithm text analysis, we found again the same pattern, that folks that are feeling financially constrained are going to write more negative reviews, basically because they were less happy when they make a purchase. So that's sort of that's the big picture of the work that Rodrigo, Anisha, and I have been doing. Is we find in general that that when you're feeling financially constrained, and you make a purchase, you're less happy than you would be otherwise. Now, so that's, I think, well, we think it's really interesting, in particular in the last couple of years when so many of us are feeling strains on our finances. But what do you do about it, right? So it'd be fantastic if I could wave my magic wand and just take away the feeling of financial constraint from many folks in America and around the world. We can't do that, obviously. So what can we do? And so one of the things that Rodrigo, Anisha, and I sort of came up with was, well, what if there was a way to get people to think about opportunity costs earlier in the decision process, and then feel essentially more justified or committed when they make a purchase, so that they don't later experience this negative feeling of, wow, maybe I should have got the toaster oven instead of the blender. And so it's actually it's a simple, very simple, but really powerful intervention. And in fact, Rodrigo's been working on this in a number of different contexts, and we find very positive results in general for, again, a simple intervention. If we get consumers to plan for their purchase, after they make the purchase, experience much lower levels of sort of thinking about, man, I really should have got that toaster oven instead of the blender. And as a result of reducing that opportunity cost consideration post-purchase, they end up really happy with the purchase. And so by basically encouraging consumers to plan, we shift where the opportunity cost consideration happens. We move it up in the decision cycle. And as a result, it's not harmful later in terms of how happy we are with the purchase, or in terms of the valence, the positive, negative feeling that we have when we do reviews. So planning it, and as I say, Rodrigo's doing lots of work in this space. Planning tends to be something in this particular instance that's really positive, but we find it in lots of contexts where planning is really a positive. And just as a quick aside, one of the really interesting results that Rodrigo has found is that he finds that if you plan for dinner, literally just make a plan, commit to what you're going to have for dinner that night, you end up way happier with your dinner. So just a sort of fun tidbit for maybe we'll be back on LinkedIn Live next year to talk about that. So okay, so that's sort of the big picture. And again, if folks have questions, please fire them away at me. I think I got the gist of what we wanted to communicate and let you guys know about sort of the latest research that we're doing here at Fuqua in this space. But generally speaking, this feeling that many of us have had of experiencing financial constraint leads to reduced happiness with the products and services that we purchase and experience. And that's because we're thinking about the alternative uses that we could have spent that money on. And one sort of very practical response to try to reduce this this impact is to simply commit to planning the purchase in advance. So we got a question coming in from Andy. So can I talk more about what people do to feel greater happiness with the items they buy, or how can the seller help cultivate that feeling? So I mean, I think that, what can we do to feel happiness with the items we buy? I mean, okay, so one thing that we know for sure is that we can plan. And if you think about what planning is doing, planning is simply, at least in my mind or our mind, planning is simply helping you do a better job up front of essentially making sure that the purchase you're going to make is a really good one, that you feel is justified and warrants the expenditure of a scarce resource, the money that we have, right? And so what can a firm do to help this? As an individual, we can plan and we can think carefully through what we want to do. As a firm, we want to make sure, I think, that our consumers are making thoughtful decisions, right? So it doesn't make any sense for a firm to try to encourage a consumer to splurge on something this once if they know that it's going to lead to reduced happiness for that consumer. That consumer is not going to come back to that firm, right? Versus if you come to Gavin's retailer and we encourage you to think about all the different things you could do with those resources, including spending them here at Gavin's or spending them on something else, and you end up making the purchase, you're going to be happier as a result. You're going to be more likely to come back to Gavin's, I think. So there's implications, I think, both for consumer welfare managed by the consumer, as well as what a firm should do in terms of encouraging thoughtful planning and purchasing. Another question in from Monica: difference between products and services. We actually thought there might be. It turns out that we don't really see much of a difference between products and services. Even we also explored, Rodrigo did a huge amount of analysis to look at differences within types of products. You might imagine, oh, maybe this is true for material goods, but not for experiential or et cetera. And we just, honestly, it's a really robust effect. It shows up over and over again across types of products and services. Let's see, Anthony, have you tested any financial wellness program impacts on positive outcomes? Example, someone enrolls in a budgeting debt management program, and that leads to a lower spend as a percentage of income and greater happiness, well-being. Great question, Anthony. So We didn't do that as part of this research project, but Isha and Rodrigo and myself, amongst other researchers, are really interested in this notion of financial well-being and happiness, and what you can do. And right now, I think it's one of the hottest areas in consumer psychology, is trying to understand how can we actually help consumers develop their individual financial literacy, if you like, so that they understand the impact of financials. And there's some great work being done, and I think that you'll start to see it get out into the broader community, out of just the academic space in the next year or two. And I hope that the work that we're doing today will plant the seed for many folks to think again about, well, what does it mean when I make a purchase? Is this good, bad, indifferent? How can I be a better consumer so that I will end up with a better sense of happiness and well-being going forward? Another question here: how can marketers use this research to help them avoid bad customer reviews, or maybe even change the way they're advertising? Example: should marketers say, make a plan to buy your items in their advertising? I honestly, I think that that's a really interesting question. And of course, we need to test it and experiment with it. But everything that we've found so far would suggest that that's exactly what you should do. And I know that that runs counterintuitive, right? Many of us have been sort of brought up in a culture where we're trying to encourage impulse buys. And you see retailers are designed to try to get you to make the impulse buy. And it's probably fine if that impulse buy is a $1 item. But when people are not planning and are coming home, I'll pick on myself. I love Costco, big Costco fan, been a member at Costco for years. I go into Costco to buy food for the family, right? I inevitably leave Costco with some durable good that I've purchased that cost a non-trivial amount of money, right? $100 plus maybe. To the degree that I've thought about it in advance and planned for it, I'm going to be way happier with that item than if I hadn't. So how can Costco do this? Well, one of the things that I sign up on the app and I get communications from Costco, and I sometimes see in advance that that there are these really cool things coming, and I think about it and I plan it so it's less of an impulse buy at the time. And I think that that's a strategy that all firms, retailers can take advantage. Well, I really appreciate the questions, you guys. It's always fun, and I know some of my alums are out there in the audience, and I love to hear from you guys. I want to thank you for joining us here at Fuqua at LinkedIn Live. We do this every first Wednesday of every month at 12:30 Eastern. And you'll hear from my colleagues about the latest, greatest work that they're doing. Next month, Wednesday, April 6th, Professor Ashley Shelby-Rosette from our management area is going to be discussing biases about leaders and whether those biases have shifted over time. If you want to follow Fuqua on LinkedIn to be alerted to these and other events, please do so. And just one last closing thought. We've been doing LinkedIn Live through the pandemic to talk about research that's important in the space. The world continues to surprise all of us in how unanticipated things continue to just impact us. And I just want to close on offering my thoughts and prayers to the people of Ukraine and all of our Ukrainian American broader family. Let's hope that we get to a peaceful resolution really quickly. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us on LinkedIn Live. All the best.